also a fellow at the Medieval Institute. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here, to have the opportunity to introduce Professor Jones. I'll say a few words about her work. This is the second Conway Lecture, which is a major event in the calendar of the Medieval Institute, and those of us affiliated with the Medieval Institute are really grateful for this series of lectures, which has its own distinguished tradition, and for the work of the Medieval Institute generally. Friends, Professor Linda Jones is an associate professor at the Department of Humanities at Universitate Pompeu, Fabra. I'm still not sure I got that right. It's close? Okay. Dr. Jones received her PhD from the Department of Religious Studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara in 2004. Her doctoral dissertation comparing Muslim and Christian preaching in medieval Iberia was awarded a national prize by the Middle East Studies Association of America, the Malcolm H. Kerr Award, a really distinguished award honoring a very important figure who was martyred in the Lebanese Civil War. She specializes in the religious cultures of Al-Andalus and the Maghreb and the Mediterranean between the 12th and 15th centuries. Her research focuses on the cultural, social, and political impact of medieval Islamic preaching and rhetoric, comparative studies of Muslim and Christian preaching in medieval Iberia, the role of religion in shaping masculinity and gendered identities in Muslim and Christian texts, and reflections of transculturalism and cultural encounters between Muslims and Christians in Umayyad, Nasrid, and Mudayhar literature. I'll mention just a few of her more recent publications, which are just a few of many. She's the co-editor of a book published by Brepols in 2019 entitled Christian, Jewish, and Muslim Preaching in the Mediterranean and Europe, Identities and Interfaith Encounters. She contributed to the 2022 Edinburgh University Press volume, Muslim Preaching in the Middle East and Beyond, Historical and Contemporary Case Studies, with an article or a chapter entitled Discourses on Marriage, Religious Identity, and Gender in Medieval and Contemporary Islamic Preaching, Continuities and Adaptations. And most recently, just this year, fresh out on the press, or of the press, is an article in Speculum, which is about representations of hegemonic masculinities in Leonese, Castilian, and Umayyad tradition. I don't think I got it spot on, but perhaps Professor Jones will clarify. It's really a delight to welcome her to Notre Dame, to the Medieval Institute. She'll be speaking to us today, as you see, on female authority in the transmission of knowledge in Muslim women's hortatory preaching. Professor Jones.
Almost tripped again. Just going to open up the water. And, oh, thanks. Okay. Well, let me begin by just thanking the Medieval Institute, thanking Thomas Berman and Megan Hall, especially for inviting me here, and for all of the organizers. It's such a thrill to be here and also to share the stage with my distinguished colleagues. And, well, I'm just very happy to be here. So thank you very much. And thank you for the gracious introduction. I wanted to just say, just to kind of set this up, that, what I'm presenting today is part of an ongoing research project that I'm carrying out within the framework of, well, it's a funded research project, which is called Intersections of Religion and Gender in Transcultural Contexts, Pre-Modern Jewish, Christian, and Muslim Iberia and the Mediterranean, which has been funded by the Spanish government and the European Union. And so what I'm presenting today is sort of, part of this research. It also taps into some of my more recent research on looking into the gender dimension of Islamic preaching, so looking at from all sorts of angles. So looking at, for example, preaching about women by men. Today, of course, I'm going to be looking at, a few examples of what our sources have to tell us about women preachers. And this research also kind of is sort of, comes within the context of another line of research I've been carrying out lately that has to do, well, I've been sort of engaging with the scholarship in religious studies on what they call Sufi feminism, right? So there's this whole debate about the extent to which Sufism is more gender egalitarian or not, and so I'm sort of addressing some of those issues too. All right then, so let's get started. Ibn Qunfudh, a late 14th century Algerian hagiographer of the female Sufi saint Aziza as-Saksawiya, admirably described how whenever she attended the mixed-gender religious assemblies, she would sit in the middle and deliver sermons, exhortations, and juridical responses to everyone, displaying such confident authority that no one would move without her order. And yet, Ibn Qunfudh's contemporary, the Egyptian jurist Ibn al-Hajj, denounced the moral corruption of men, women, and children all mingled together before the male or the female hortatory preacher. And he urged the authorities to forbid women from attending the assembly of some woman whom they claimed to be a female sheikha, that is a female religious leader. Although Ibn al-Hajj provides no information about this anonymous female sheikha, we may infer from his text that she could have been a Sufi mystic like Aziza as-Saksawiya, and therefore exhibited a higher degree of devotional piety and religious knowledge than the average Muslim women of the day. And while Ibn Qunfudh and Ibn al-Hajj were near contemporaries and they both followed the Maliki school of Islamic law, they espoused conflicting opinions about the status and propriety of Muslim women preaching in public. Their contrasting opinions are symptomatic of larger historical deliberations among medieval male Muslim religious elites and contemporary Muslim feminist scholars concerning the roles Muslim women played in the transmission of knowledge, the nature of female religious authority, and the extent and limitations of women's involvement in Islam's oral and written traditions. So in this paper, I'm going to analyze the role and the authority of pre-modern Muslim women as transmitters of knowledge through their activities as hortatory preachers. In a recent publication on Sufi Muslim saints, the scholar Scott Kugel observed that the real transgression of saintly women was not to develop an unconventional personal spiritual practice or experience mystical states. The real transgression was to go public and enter the public arena by preaching, teaching, exhorting, and being visible. Only by going public did women break all the cords of the safety net of being a good woman in a patriarchal society. I generally concur with Kugel's observations that for Muslim women, going public by preaching, exhorting, and teaching in arenas populated by non-mahram men, that is, men that they are not related to, not blood relatives or in-laws, that could be a litmus test of female authority, since it potentially entailed not only transgressing the normative spaces of gender segregation, but also the normative gender order of a Muslim society, which accords men ontological, biological, and intellectual superiority over women. In this traditional Islamic order, which scholars, modern feminist scholars such as Dudaraja, Alec, and Hisong have dubbed gender oppositionality, men have the right to exert spiritual and ritual authority over women and the duty to take responsibility for the religious education of their womenfolk. Now, while Sufism, or the Islamic mystical tradition, is by no means monolithic, scholars such as Scott Kugel, and especially the proponents of Sufi feminism, such as Saadia Sheikh and Hamdi Hassan, agree that Sufism provides greater opportunities to achieve gender egalitarianism, since many of its practitioners recognize that men and women have the same capacity to achieve spiritual perfection, and that a female Sufi master does indeed have authority over her male disciples. Yet most of the research on Sufi women and Muslim female saints is focused on the visible embodied signs of women's sanctity, their charismatic gifts and Gnostic, visionary, or miraculous powers, rather than on their speech or the impact of their preaching and their teaching. So I contend that this continued focus on female embodiment, even if it intends to demonstrate that some extraordinary women are able to transcend the physicality of their gender, that this continues to perpetuate the gendered binary opposition that associates women with the body and men with the spirit and the intellect. Hence, my research on female preaching seeks to overcome this dichotomy by focusing our attention on women's words as a means of displaying their gnosis, on women's engagement in homiletics as a means to transmit religious knowledge and morals, as well as on representations of female preachers by male authors. Sorry. So, where am I? So, in a very real sense, the lack of scholarly attention to Muslim female orators is a logical outcome of the problems with the available sources and the customary prohibitions against women engaging in liturgical preaching. Regarding the sources, the Muslim world developed an abundance of prosopographic genres, among them biographical dictionaries of notables who practiced the same profession, or belonged to the same legal school, religious sect, or who came from a particular geographic region. Other important sources include hagiographies describing the virtues and miraculous deeds of Muslim saints or Sufi mystics, or who record the lives and teachings of an individual Sufi master. And then, of course, we have literary anthologies, which typically include biographical data about the authors. And in some cases, in hortatory sermons, we also have data about, obviously about women saints. But as is the case in medieval Latin Christendom, such texts were written usually by men and therefore reflect an androcentric perspective, even when the male author is purporting to record the deeds of a female saint or a mystic. And in fact, in the Christian world, of course, there's an advantage in that, as you all know better than I do, there are some women, female authors. And I actually encountered one case of a biographical dictionary by an Andalusi Iberian woman who wrote a book which was called El Kitab Fiqhiyan al-Andalus, or the Book of the Female Singers of Al-Andalus, by a woman named Fath bint al-Ja'far from the 11th century, but unfortunately the text has not survived, but at least we have one example. So, now in practice this means, though, with all of these male-authored texts, that women are marginalized in the literature either through their complete exclusion or through various strategies of minoritization, such as relegation to a final chapter or to an appendix of a larger work, or a significantly smaller number of entries about women in comparison to their male counterparts, or sparser details about their lives, their accomplishments, and sometimes even negating or even erasing basic information like their names. Nevertheless, we shall see that useful information about female preachers can be obtained through these sources, and moreover, that there are a few rare examples of prosopographic works dedicated exclusively to women. Now, the scarcity of the biographical data about women preachers is obviously explained by the aforementioned tradition of banning women from delivering the liturgical khutbah, the liturgical sermon. This does not mean, however, that women did not engage in other types of preaching. And nor is it coincidence that these Muslim female preachers practiced asceticism or Sufism. And this is interesting because Muslim feminist scholars of Islam and scholars in the recent subfield of Sufi feminism maintain that gender egalitarianism and a feminist consciousness are rooted in the origins of Islam, particularly in verses of the Quran, such as this verse here from chapter 33, verse 35, where you have, inclusive language throughout, men and women, devout men and women, true men and women, etc. It says this in the Arabic as well. So because of this, the scholars argue that patriarchal and misogynistic male interpreters of the Quran and inventors of the hadiths, or the tradition of the sayings of the Prophet, that these people hijacked the Islamic tradition and introduced hierarchical gendered thinking that discriminates against women. So scholars of Sufism, Sufi feminism, such as Saadia Sheikh and Hamdi Hassan, insist that the principle of gender equality was always intrinsic to Sufism, and their research provides some compelling evidence of how Sufism subverts the notion of gender oppositionality and disrupts normative gender boundaries, hierarchies, and roles. And indeed, it suffices to note that many prominent medieval Sufi men address the topic of gender equality, not using that language, of course, but for all intents and purposes. So, for example, this 11th century Iranian Sufi ascetic Abu Abdurrahman as-Sulami was a prolific author of multiple works on Sufism that defined the basic concepts and vocabulary of this tradition and recorded the lives and the sayings of famous Sufi practitioners. And his works include, and you have, an English translation, a number of his works that have been translated into English, and they include Hagiographic Compendium of a Sufi women, which is this last one here that I have highlighted in bold. Dhikr al-Niswa al-Muta'abidat al-Sufiyat, the memorial of ascetic Sufi women, which has been translated into English by Ruqayya Cornell as the early Sufi women. And Cornell says of as-Sulami that he portrays Sufi women as full equals of their male counterparts in religion and intellect, as well as in their knowledge of Sufi doctrines and practices. And indeed, several notices in this work, Dhikr al-Niswa, feature female Sufi hortatory preachers. We also have the 13th century Andalusi Sufi master, Ibn Arabi, arguably one of the most famous and influential Sufis in the whole of Islamic history, who was another defender of gender parity. He was the author of two hagiographic collections, which have been compiled into this English translation, Sufis of Andalusia, in which he mentions one of his disciples being this elderly Sufi woman, Fatima bint al-Muthanna, and he was her disciple for 2 years. And then in his magnum opus, Futuhat al-Makkiyah, a work on Sufi esoteric knowledge and the spiritual states, he says the following, that perfection is not barred to women. And if woman is indeed 1 degree lower than a man, this does not detract from her attainment of spiritual perfection. So he's addressing this Quranic verse that talks about women being a degree lower than men, and yet he's saying that this doesn't mean that, a woman cannot attain spiritual perfection. He also maintained that men and women can equally attain all the ranks in the hierarchy of Islamic sanctity, including the highest rank of the pole or the qutb. These gender egalitarian views of Ibn Arabi and as-Sulami regarding Sufi women are also echoed in a collection of popular hortatory sermons called Al-Rawd al-Fa'iq fil Mawa'iz wal Raqa'iq, or the sublime meadows of hortatory and edifying sermons, by Shu'aib al-Hurafish, a late 14th century popular Egyptian Sufi preacher. In a sermon, one of his sermons that he dedicated to pious Sufi and ascetic women, he began the sermon by reciting that same Quranic verse that I mentioned before, chapter 33, 35, and then he elaborated on it by saying, that God has equated the mention of the pious women and with that of the pious men, and that women have the same mystical states, abilities to practice asceticism, to perform good deeds as the men do, and also to undertake journeys in order to devote themselves exclusively to the spiritual devotions, etc. So the writings of influential male Sufis such as as-Sulami, Ibn Arabi, and Shu'aib al-Hurafish illustrate that in Sufi texts, ranging from an elite esoteric work such as Ibn Arabi's Al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah to Ibn Arabi and as-Sulami's hagiographies of Sufi mystics, to collections of popular hortatory sermons such as al-Hurafish's Rawd al-Fa'iq, we do find affirmations that a woman has the same spiritual, intellectual, and rational faculties as a man, the same capacity to attain the highest spiritual states, and the same potential to achieve spiritual perfection. And while it is true that not all Sufi men subscribe to gender egalitarianism, many agree that spiritually elevated Sufi women could wield spiritual and ritual authority over men. And significantly, these sources attest that some Sufi women manifested this religious authority over men through hortatory preaching. So in what follows, I'm going to briefly explain Islam's homiletic genres and the nature of the sources available for the study of Muslim preaching. And then drawing on a variety of medieval Islamic biographical, hagiographic, homiletic, and juridical sources from across the Islamic world, I'm going to analyze the representations of women preachers, and when applicable, the substance of their sermons. Since, as noted, the reports of women's sermons are preserved in male-authored texts, I will also discuss the implied gender dynamics of these male-female homiletic encounters. Sorry. So here it basically just suffices to note that there are two major traditions of Islamic preaching, one which is called the khutbah, and the other which is called waz. Now, khutbah, as we see here, can be translated as oration, sermon, speech, or address, which is simply a recognition of the fact that the khutbah is used not only for religious preaching, it's a ritualized speech on other topics as well. But we do have this subgenre of the khutbah shar'iyya, or khutbah minbariyya, which is, in fact, a ritual that has a fixed place in the Islamic liturgy and legal norms that determine the precise time, place, and the way it should be delivered, as well as the requisite qualities of the preacher, who is known as a khatib. And one of these requirements is that the liturgical khatib be a man, since women were prohibited by law from undertaking ritual leadership roles, such as leading the prayer, the communal prayer. As I said, the second major genre is waz, homiletic exhortation, or a discrete or an individual sermon might be called a maw'idha, and it comes from this verb wa'idha, meaning to warn, exhort, or admonish. And of course, the preachers of these types of sermons are called a wa'idh if it's a man, and a wa'idha if it's a woman. Contrary to what is implied by the term, hortatory preaching, preachers did not use these sermons only to warn about the punishments of disobeying God or the Prophet Muhammad, but also to instruct and advise the people about their religious duties, to guide them toward righteousness in accordance with the Quranic principle of enjoining what is right and forbidding what is wrong, or to inspire them with stories about the virtues of the prophets and other pious heroes, to incite piety with tales of the spiritual merits and rewards associated with certain prayers and types of devotion. Now, while it can be firmly established that the female orator, the khatiba, is very much a rarity, a recent study by an Egyptian scholar named Muhammad Abbas Abdurrahman al-Mughni on women's preaching, that is waz, its roots and advocacy and its future prospects, suggests that this definitely was not the case with the female wa'idha. The author drew attention to precedents in early Islamic history of women preachers of waz in order to advocate for a greater role for Muslim women preaching today in society. Al-Mughni cited several hadiths indicating that the Prophet Muhammad had entrusted men and women alike with the responsibilities of waz and of commanding right and forbidding wrong. And among those mentioned are some of his wives, his first wife Khadija, and one of his other wives, Salama. And also we have reports from the early caliphs, such as during the reign of Omar ibn al-Khattab, who reigned between 634 and 644, that this caliph appointed a woman named Shifa bint Abdullah to supervise the affairs of one of the markets in Mecca. And one of the duties of the supervision entailed preaching, standing up and preaching in the marketplace about commanding right and forbidding wrong in the context of, the marketplace. We also know that according to the 10th century Cordovan belletrist Ibn Abdul Rabbi, that this kind of preaching was particularly associated with ascetics and dealt mainly with ascetic themes. And we also know that in ensuing centuries, as Sufism began to develop, Sufi mystics adopted the hortatory preaching assembly as a venue to spread Sufi ethics and practices to a broader audience. And because hortatory preaching was not subject to the same ritual and legal restraints as the liturgical khutbah, the reports of women preaching in the biographies, biographical dictionaries, and hagiographies compiled from the 11th century onward refer to women preaching, in the context of this genre. So now I'm going to turn to some reports, the meager bits of information that we have about these women. So from the 10th century onward, we find increasing numbers of notices about female hortatory preachers in two prosopographic genres that are always composed or compiled by men. So first of all, we've got biographical dictionaries of scholars and other notables, and then we've got these hagiographic compendia of Sufis and ascetics. And yet the presentation of the data in these types of works differ significantly. As Maria Jesus Viguera and Ruth Roded, among other scholars, have observed, the biographical notices are extremely brief and formulaic. And so in what follows, I'm going to reproduce in translation some of these notices from a variety of authors, and then I'll just sort of briefly comment on them. And so the first thing to notice that despite the brevity of the notices, important information can be gleaned about these female preachers, although many other questions remain unanswered. For example, only in 3 cases did the biographers specify that women preached before an all-female audience. And so the first example of this is one I have here from an author who himself was a very important hortatory preacher from Iraq, Ibn al-Jawzi, who mentions this woman, Fatima bint al-Hasan al-Fadlawiya al-Razi, as a pious, devout hortatory preacher who owned a religious lodge where ascetic women would gather to listen to her sermons. And then we have a later source, a Syrian source, Imam al-Dhahabi, from the 14th century, who wrote the same notice about her, almost verbatim, except that he just inserted the fact that she was a famous preacher. Then we have the case of, skip that one, the case of a 13th century Iberian author, Ibn al-Abar, who wrote a biographical dictionary in which he mentioned this woman, Rashida al-Wa'ida, Rashida, the hortatory preacher, who used to travel throughout Al-Andalus, preaching and exhorting the women. She had a good reputation and excelled in piety and goodness. And the last example of these is a 15th century Egyptian chronicle in which the author, Sakhawi, gives a notice about Bayram, Ibnat Ahmed bin Muhammad bin Surur, who accompanied her father on a journey to Jerusalem where she took lessons from eminent male scholars, religious scholars, and she preached exhortations to women. So that leads me to ask, when male authors do not indicate that female preachers preached only to women, are we to assume that they preached before mixed audiences? And I mention this just because I have a couple of other sources here, a collection of obituaries by a 14th century author, Safadi, who mentions this woman, Safia bint Abdurrahman, and he just mentions simply that she was a virtuous hortatory preacher and a belle lettrist from Baghdad, and of beautiful, irreproachable conduct. And then I have one more, equally short, from a 12th century Iranian source, mentioning this woman, Aisha bint al-Hasan al-Warkani, as a scholarly woman and a hortatory preacher. So, I wonder about whether these women preached before mixed audiences. But contrarily, is the mention that when authors mention that women preach to all female audiences, is this intended to assuage the concerns of their male readers, who might doubt or disparage women's capacity for scholarship or for assuming the responsibilities of preaching and teaching, or who might believe that it was inappropriate for women to preach before mixed gender audiences? Now, as mentioned in the introduction of this paper, let me just go back to, right. The 14th century Egyptian jurist Ibn al-Hajj denounced the heinous immorality of men, women, and children all mingled together before a male or a female hortatory preacher. But note, however, that he was not denouncing here the existence of the female hortatory preacher per se, but rather the failure of audiences to segregate properly according to gender. As stated, presumably he would have approved of the preaching assembly had the audience been separated according to gender, independent of the gender of the preacher. Similarly, when we look at another statement that he said, upon first glance, his call for women to be forbidden from attending the assembly of someone whom they claimed to be a female sheikha, it might be interpreted as a blanket condemnation of all women preachers. However, such an interpretation is unlikely given his previous statement about attending the assemblies of the male or the female hortatory preacher. So therefore, a more likely explanation is that Ibn al-Hajj was condemning certain female preachers whose credentials in the requisite religious knowledge of the Quran, scriptural exegesis, and the hadiths, the building blocks of sermons, had not been properly vetted by male religious elites. So while Ibn al-Hajj certainly exhibits male chauvinism, because he went on to accuse the same woman of meddling in Quranic exegesis and spinning tales about the prophets, it bears noting that the aforementioned 12th century Iraqi hortatory preacher Ibn al-Jawzi wrote a widely disseminated manual for hortatory preachers in which he condemned the ignorance and the improper conduct of male charlatan hortatory preachers and storytellers, accusing them of the same deficiencies in religious knowledge. Now, the women presented thus far represent a small yet typical example of biographical notices about female hortatory preachers, which, according to Muhammad al-Mughni, began to proliferate precisely in the 14th century. For instance, al-Mughni cites the names of 18 hortatory women preachers mentioned in one of the texts that I referred to, Imam al-Dhahabi's History of Islam. Now, taken together, this brief survey of biographical notices attests to the phenomenon of female hortatory attests that the phenomenon of female hortatory preachers was known throughout a broad expanse of the Islamic world. As we saw, the authors were Iberians, Egyptians, Palestinians, Syrians, Iraqis, and Iranians, although the greatest number of women preachers appeared to come from the eastern cities in Iran and Iraq. A final observation about these biographical notices of female preachers is that none of the authors provides any information about the content of the preaching. And so this is one of the principal differences between the biographical dictionaries and the hagiographic literature, the latter of which often records the words of the protagonists. According to the scholar Jürgen Pohl, Muslim hagiography developed in the 11th century initially with the apologetic agenda of defending Sufism and its adherents in the face of more conservative religious scholars, by stressing that the characteristics and doctrines of the eminent Sufis of the past were in accordance with the texts of Muslim revelation, and that the current generations of Sufis are indeed the heirs of the Prophet Muhammad through a continuous chain of transmission. Now, recorded speech plays a vital role in Islamic hagiography. It is through dialogues between Sufis that the degree of the Sufis' knowledge, the nature of their spiritual states, and their virtues are verified, and Sufi genealogies are established and authenticated. Dialogues between a Sufi and his or her detractors serve to vindicate the orthodoxy of their Sufism, and they bear witness to the Sufi's miraculous powers or spiritual gifts. And for Sufi adepts, the words of a Sufi or an ascetic in the forms of prayers, invocations, exhortations, sermons, teachings, ecstatic utterances, or poetry provide inspiration, guidance, models to emulate, and confirmation of their particular path as the path to spiritual perfection. Even the briefest of hagiographic notices usually include a quotation from the Sufi that epitomizes his or her approach to piety and proof of sanctity. Hence, hagiography is one of the few literary genres, apart from poetry, that allows us to hear the words of women, albeit mediated through and transmitted through the pen of their male hagiographies. So now I'm going to turn to hagiographic notices about women preachers. So I'm going to analyze a few examples of the hortatory preaching of female Sufi mystics. So I'm going to begin by referring back to the example of this 14th century Algerian Sufi saint, Aziza el-Saksawiya, whose disciples included her hagiographer and compatriot Ibn Qunfud. Now, the first thing Ibn Qunfud tells us is that he used to accompany her whenever she was entreated to mediate disputes between contesting political factions, which shows that women were engaged in the took part also in the socio-political functions of sanctity in Maghrebi society. He also tells us that her religious followers included male and female disciples, and also that whenever she attended these mixed gender assemblies, she would sit in the middle of the assembly, a little bit closer to where the women sat, and she would wear a garment over her that wouldn't allow her to see who she was talking to, and they couldn't see her. But nevertheless, she exuded such confidence and authority that when she preached, no one would dare to move without her order, and she was so eloquent that people came in droves to listen to her. Now, although Ibn Qunfud says nothing about the substance of her preaching, he provides a clear picture of a powerful Sufi woman whose spiritual authority and religious knowledge were uncontested, not only among her fellow Sufis, but also among the leading men in society who sought her out to mediate in their political disputes. Regarding her preaching, Ibn Qunfud lauded her extreme eloquence, implying that she was talented from a rhetorical point of view, but also charismatic. Unfortunately, he doesn't say where she held these assemblies. It must have been in a large public space. We don't know if it was in a main mosque or private mosque, but it is clear from his description that her preaching to before mixed gender audiences caused no controversy. And undoubtedly, this was because she was covered up and no one could see her, and also because the audience was duly segregated according to gender. A similar portrait emerges in the notice that the aforementioned 10th century Iranian Sufi As-Salami dedicated to an Iraqi woman named Sha'wana. The fact that she's simply called Sha'wana indicates that she was an enslaved woman. And this is verified, in fact, in later hagiographic sources where she's actually called Sha'wana el-Abida, Sha'wana the enslaved woman. As-Sulami describes her as a remarkable person who had a beautiful and melodious voice, that she preached to the people and recited the Quran to them. Her sessions were attended by all different categories of ascetics, and she herself was known for her extreme asceticism and for those who fear God and who weep and who make others weep. So this is a charismatic gift. He then quoted a saying attributed to her without providing more details about it, but he said, and we have it here, that she used to say, "Can an eye be separated from its beloved and yearn to be united with him without weeping? This is not right." Since As-Sulami indicated that Sha'wana used to say this frequently, in all likelihood she also said it in her sermons. Now, as noted, among her saintly attributes was the charismatic gift of religious weeping and the ability to make others cry. So this frequently repeated statement hints at how she might have used her preaching to inspire her audience to imitate or try to cultivate religious weeping as well. He also portrays her as an influential spiritual leader who attracted a large following among all the categories of ascetics, males and females. And given Sha'wana's enslaved condition, the societal gender norms about female modesty did not apply, so she would not necessarily have needed to, cover herself in a heavy veil or anything. But the fact that she was an enslaved woman renders the religious authority that she wielded over her male and female devotees all the more remarkable and socially transgressive. Now, for a more detailed account of women's hortatory sermons, I turn now to an extraordinary hagiography dedicated entirely to a single female saint, the 13th century Tunisian saint named Aisha el-Manoubiya. So to put her biography in perspective, the hagiographic collection compiled by the aforementioned Algerian Ibn Khunfud contained about 250 hagiographic notices, only 5 of which were dedicated to women. And yet, by contrast, we actually have 2 hagiographies that were dedicated to this single woman. And we have the titles of them here. The earliest one, whose author we know by name, Muhammad ibn Sabag, was important. He was one of the most important early chroniclers of the Shadhili Sufi order, which is the order that Aisha allegedly belonged to. The second hagiography is a bit later. It's anonymous, but the editor, Nelly Ambri, identifies or believes that the author was indeed a Sufi and was probably a prayer leader at the mosque of Manuban, the town where where the saint was from. Now, since Aisha died in either 1267 or 1268, neither of these hagiographers were her contemporaries, and yet each author incorporated extensive oral testimonies from Aisha's reputed disciples and other contemporary eyewitnesses who spoke to her directly or who listened to her sermons or ecstatic utterances. And they mentioned that they record 4 types of speech from her. The first type are her ecstatic utterances, in which the saint proclaims, she makes these self-referential affirmations about her elevated position in the cosmic hierarchy with respect to God and positioning herself above all other Sufi saints. The second type are the recordings of her supererogatory prayers and invocations. The third are recorded conversations, reputed conversations between the saint and either those who supported her or asked for her aid or her detractors. And then finally, the spontaneous hortatory sermons that she preached at the behest of one of her followers. Now, before discussing her sermons, I just want to give you a sense from one of these ecstatic utterances of who this amazing woman was. So we have, part of this recorded speech. I am God's saving power in the earth and the heavens. I have not taken this mystical way as an inheritance from anyone. This is important because she's attached to the Shadhili order, and she's claiming here she does not, she was not a disciple of a Shadhili or anyone else. Rather, I have taken it directly as a gift directly from my Lord. God has shown me God's self and given me the power to take spiritual qualities from Mary. She's talking about the Virgin Mary. Mary has 3 special qualities as revealed in the Quran, and like Mary, I also have these 3 special qualities. God has nourished me, God has spoken to me, and God has supported me, and God has purified me, etc. So this statement is really extraordinary, even within the parameters of sainthood in Islam and the Sufi hagiographic tradition. As we see, she herself claimed to be a saving power of God, a kind of a cosmic mediator between God and everything, both on heaven and on earth. Now, early Muslim theologians articulated a distinction between prophethood and sainthood. Whereas prophets, by definition, receive their knowledge directly from God via revelation, saints acquired their gnosis by studying under, spiritual masters. And yet in the above statement, she emphasizes that she did not learn the Sufi way from any human Sufi, but rather directly from God, who personally bestowed his gifts upon her. And then in this other statement, I am the venerable lady of the Sufi spiritual men. It's just one of many affirmations that display her conscious transgression of gender boundaries through her claim to be the leader, the female leader, the Sayyida of the men. And she always emphasizes that it's the men. And her authority was also particularly transgressive, given her youth, her absolutely stunning beauty. She began being a Sufi when she was a young girl. She was a stunning beauty. She never married, she refused to get married, and she would lure men, she would use her beauty to lure men, sinful men, and, get them to repent and turn toward the Sufi path. And she was always seen unchaperoned, frequenting these majlises, these assemblies, surrounded by non-mahram men. Now, the hagiography records several such episodes that reveal the tensions provoked by her violation of normative gender boundaries and gender role expectations. So now to the handouts. You've got the first, I'm going to reference now the first sermon. This one, which is recorded by one of her male novices, Uthman al-Haddad, who's the source of several accounts about her preaching, which includes this following one, which he asks her to preach an exhortation to him, and this occurs shortly before she dies, right? And so we have the words here, where she's basically giving him moral exhortations. Don't be proud, don't be arrogant, search for the uninhabited places and seclusion. Because of the servant empties his heart of the thought of men, God will fill it. So she's always emphasizing this retreat from society. Interestingly, despite her association with the Shadhili order, she says avoid the assemblies of the poor Sufis of our day because their meetings are lies, their hearts are devoid of intimacy with God, and their ritual invocations are absent of any sentiment. And, he asked her to preach to him some more. And so she goes on. Again, don't search for the company of men, isolate yourselves, etc. This constant search for solitude and avoiding the company of other people. And then when she's done, we see that Uthman, she directed Uthman to open his mouth, and she gave him water to drink with her own hands. And he said, now we have his recorded speech, I drank, and after that sip, the divine mystery and sanctity were perfected in me. So we can really readily see that this exhortation is far more extensive than the one-liner Sulami quoted in his hagiographic notice of the Iraqi Sufi Shawana. And yet, whereas Shawana and the Algerian Sufi saint Aziz al-Saksawiya delivered their sermons in public assemblies before large mixed-gender audiences, Aisha al-Manubiya improvised this private, one-on-one hortatory sermon at the behest of a single male disciple. Such private hortatory sermons are a common motif in Sufi hagiographies. The three other reports of Aisha's sermons occur under similar circumstances. The second one of which is in the second text is posthumous. So like all hagiographies, Aisha al-Manubiya's biographers include numerous accounts of her posthumous miracles and intercessions. And it's remarkable to note that some of these intercessions take the form of oneric apparitions to a male devotee who requests her to preach an exhortation to him. And so we have one of these where the unnamed novice visited her tomb, and he's praying before her tomb, and he's quoting this, reciting this verse from the Quran. And then he returns home, and she appears to him in a dream, and he speaks to her in this dream, and she says, preach a sermon to me. And then we have their words in the handout, where she's saying, if you wish the mystical lights to be unveiled to you, then you must visit the chosen one. She means the Prophet Muhammad. If you wish to mitigate the solitude of someone's grave, when you go and pray before the grave of someone, then you should pray for blessings on the Prophet Muhammad. And so he asks, how am I supposed to pray about, to bless the Prophet Muhammad? And then she gives him the prayer formula. Say, O God, bless our Lord Muhammad, the owner of the light, etc. And so we have her recorded words. And then the notice goes on to say that after this exhortation, the novice said, I persevered in this prayer for several days, and God opened my heart to spiritual illumination by the virtue of that prayer of blessings upon our Lord Muhammad. So as with the previous sermon delivered to Aisha's disciple Uthman al-Haddad, here too, through her requested posthumous homiletic exhortation, Aisha al-Manubiya transmits knowledge about specific deeds, conduct, ritual utterances, and devotional practices that will lead her devotees to mystical illumination. So by way of comparison, let's briefly consider the third example in the handout, which comes from the aforementioned 14th century Sufi hortatory preacher Shu'aib al-Hurayfish in that sermon that he preached on pious women. He tells a bunch of anecdotes, one of which is about a famous a Sufi from the 9th century, Dhunnun al-Masri, who's talking about the beginning of his Sufi journey. So he goes on this journey and he's trying to find God, and he surreptitiously sees this woman, praying to God. And so he becomes convinced of her singular devotion to God, and so he asks her to please guide him on the mystical path and lead him by the path of words. And so she responds by improvising this brilliant sermon, really eloquent in rhymed prose. And so you have the text here. I won't read the whole thing in the interest of time, but maybe just the first line. O Luanun, make reverence for God, your greatness, and the hereafter your quest. Asceticism and scrupulous piety your mount, and retirement from the world, to God Almighty your natural disposition. And you can see with the words highlighted in bold the rhymes. Ij'al taqwa zadaka, wal akhira maradaka, wa zuht wal wara matiyataka, wal intiqa' ila Allah sajiyataka. So you can kind of hear the rhyme there, right? And then it goes on. And let's see now, oops, I'm missing a page. Then Luanun comments after hearing this sermon. He says, her words impacted me in my heart and were the cause of my reconciliation with God. In other words, he is accrediting this anonymous Sufi woman with being the person who really turned him on to the Sufi path. And he would go on to be one of the most famous Sufis in the Islamic world. So I contend that these one-on-one preaching sessions are a narrative performance of the Sufi master-disciple relationship. The individual who preaches wields the position of authority, while the listener is the seeker of knowledge. The act of homiletic exhortation is a manifestation of the saints' leadership, a proof of their elevated spiritual condition and gnosis, a vehicle for the transmission of religious, spiritual, and ritual knowledge and ethical guidance, as well as the secrets to spiritual perfection. The person who requests the Sufi saint or teacher to preach an exhortation to them is performing an act of piety and devotion, and the sermon is typically portrayed as having a transformative impact on the listener. So in the above examples, Aisha's exhortations to her disciple Uthman al-Haddad and her unnamed devotee led them to attain spiritual perfection and mystical illumination. And similarly, in Shu'aib al-Hurayfish's sermon, the renowned Egyptian Sufi Luanun al-Masri credited this exhortation with initiating him fully onto the Sufi path. So to conclude, in one real sense, there is no doubt that women preachers are marginalized in the normative Islamic tradition, judging by the generalized custom of prohibiting women from delivering the liturgical sermon or the liturgical khutbah. The exceptional circumstances in which a handful of elite, well-connected women delivered political orations in the first centuries of Islam, and then we don't hear anything more about this, and then the relatively small number of female hortatory preachers in comparison with their male counterparts. And yet the evidence from the biographical dictionaries, hagiographies, and legal texts demonstrates that these women did in fact preach, and that they were not always constrained to preach only before all-female audiences. So it's therefore possible that in the case of the Egyptian jurist Ibn al-Hajj's condemnation, that men, women, and children were all mingled together before a male or a female hortatory preacher, and also in the discreet silences of those biographers of female preachers who made it a point of not mentioning that a woman preached before an all-female audience, that these could be indicators that there was nothing unusual about a pious, erudite female hortatory preacher delivering a sermon before a mixed audience, provided the societal norms regarding gender modesty and the gender segregation of the audience in public spaces was maintained. These observations complement the findings of the scholar Asma Said's comparative analysis of notices about women in two biographical dictionaries, one by this aforementioned Egyptian, 15th century Egyptian Sufi as-Sakhawi, and another by a later source, a 17th century Algerian source. So she concludes that the general picture that emerges is of women who were active in both receiving and imparting religious knowledge, particularly in the transmission of hadith. The notion of sexually segregated space that we take for granted as a defining feature of medieval Muslim society is challenged by what these biographical accounts have to tell us about the formal and informal settings in which women scholars conducted their activity. Women are depicted as freely studying with men and other women, and becoming credentialed as teachers, and they would go on to teach both men and women. And the settings include the madrasa, which is an institution of higher learning, as well as informal study circles and even private homes. Now, Asma Said's observations about women hadith transmitters largely coincides with reports that I've commented on about the enslaved Iraqi woman Shahwana and the Algerian Saint Aziza Saksawiya, both of whom hosted mixed-gender public hortatory preaching assemblies, in which their male hagiographers reported on this without alluding to any controversy at all. Moreover, the hagiographic accounts of private one-on-one hortatory sessions involved a Sufi woman preaching to a non-mahram man. Now, while such accounts reflect gender egalitarianism, insofar as the male novice heeds the guidance and the exhortations of a spiritually superior woman, it is also possible that these private informal sermons were sanctioned by the male hagiographers and the male readership precisely because the social taboo of women going public by preaching in public was avoided. Moreover, we must not overlook the androcentric bias in these male-authored hagiographies dedicated to the Tunisian woman saint Aisha al-Manoubiya. For while scholars such as Nellie Amri, Katja Boussavain, and Scott Kugel have rightly commented upon the virtually unprecedented spiritual authority accorded to this female saint, they overlook the fact that at least in the earliest hagiographies, all of the beneficiaries of her intercessions, all of them, including of hortatory preaching, they're only men, giving the impression that only men have the capacity to reach spiritual illumination and attain spiritual perfection, at least via this saint. On the other hand, we can't forget that, indeed, there were several of the notices from biographical dictionaries that specified that female preachers preached before all female audiences. Here, it's just important to note the Islamic world is not a monolith and that it's entirely possible that in certain places female preaching was only tolerated if the women restricted their sermons to members of their own gender, while in other places it may not have been tolerated at all. Finally, regarding the substance of the sermons, the passages considered here demonstrate that women's preaching bears all the hallmarks of authoritative speech. And I know I didn't really do a linguistic study of it, but we've got exhortations, warnings, direct imperative commands, assertives, declarative statements. In short, the very speech functions that gender specialists and social linguists associate with masculinity and with masculine authoritative speech. At the same time, the sermons of Aisha al-Manoubiya and the anonymous Sufi woman who preached to the Wanun al-Masri transmitted detailed guidance and instructions on how to draw near to God and attain spiritual perfection and mystical gnosis through ascetic retreat in society and the performance of specific ritual acts. And yet the fact that their speech was recorded by male hagiographers and framed narratively as private esoteric knowledge transmitted only to male novices exposes, in my opinion, the limitations of the thesis of Sufi gender egalitarianism, and hence at a limited tolerance for women going public by preaching even within a Sufi milieu. So that's it.